7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public.
Are now being deciphered 2,000 years later, thanks in part to artificial intelligence.
Deep inside the ruins of a Dead Sea synagogue, archaeologists found a scroll so badly burned it crumbled into powder at the slightest touch.
And that is a phenomenon that we see that affects the Dead Sea Scrolls no less than any other kind of archaeological artifact.
For more than 40 years, no one could read even a single letter. Then AI stepped in and rebuilt the writing line by line.
This is the lab where experts examine fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered 70 years ago.
And when the text finally appeared, its message was nothing like what scholars expected. The burned Ark Scroll nobody could read. In the early 1970s, a team of Israeli archaeologists were working at Ein Gedi, a small oasis village on the western side of the Dead Sea. Ein Gedi had fresh springs, palm trees, terraced fields, and a long Jewish history. Ancient writers like Josephus and Pliny the Elder described it as a place with rich date palms and valuable balsam plants that were used for perfume and medicine. Over many centuries, this little oasis had been a real town with houses, workshops, and later, a large synagogue at its center. By the time the modern diggers arrived, the synagogue was a ruin. The stone walls still traced the outline of the prayer hall. The floor preserved parts of a colorful mosaic carpet with Hebrew and Aramaic words, a list of names, and even a warning not to reveal the secret of the town to outsiders. That inscription probably referred to the recipe for the precious balsam oil that made the village rich. For the people who once lived there, this synagogue was the heart of the community. They gathered there to pray, to hear the Torah read, and to keep their identity alive under changing rulers. The synagogue itself had been discovered a few years earlier by chance, when members of the modern kibbutz at Ein Gedi were laying a water pipe and hit ancient walls. Proper excavations followed in the 1970s. Archaeologists found that the synagogue building went through several phases. It began as a simpler hall and was later rebuilt as a more impressive basilica-style structure with a raised platform for reading, decorative mosaics, and a special niche or cabinet on the western side. That niche was the Ark, the holiest spot in the building, where Torah scrolls were kept. On a day in May of 1970, the team opened that Ark. Behind the stone and plaster, they expected the remains of scrolls, but what they actually saw looked more like pieces of burned wood. Inside the Ark and on the floor nearby were several lumps of material, completely black, crushed and shiny from burning. These were not clean rolls of leather. They looked like charcoal. Every time someone tried to lift one, tiny flakes broke off and fell away. Even so, the team quickly realized these were not random bits of wood. The shape, the position in the Ark, and the fact that they were layered like tight rolls all pointed to one thing. These were Torah scrolls, handwritten copies of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible that had once been read out loud to the people of Ein Gedi. Ein Gedi's synagogue dated from the later Roman and Byzantine periods. The synagogue itself seems to have been built around the 3rd century of the Common Era. It remained in use until the village was destroyed by fire in the 6th or early 7th century. The burned beams, the collapsed roof, and the layer of ash across the floor all tell the same story: a sudden, violent end. Archaeologists disagree on who set that fire. Some think it was part of a campaign by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian against Jewish communities. Others suggest it was a Bedouin raid before the later Persian invasion. In either case, when the flames reached the Ark, the parchment and ink baked, collapsed, and fused into a brittle mass. Alongside the burned rolls were other objects from the same Ark: oil lamps, silver pendants, coins, glass fragments, and even bones from kosher animals that may have come from community meals. All of it together showed this was a living synagogue with regular worship and rituals, not a museum display. At this point, the archaeologists faced a very simple and harsh choice. The science of caring for old objects was not as advanced as today. If they tried to cut the scroll open by hand, they would almost certainly destroy it. If they left it alone, it would stay intact, but no one would ever know what was written inside. The archaeologists and museum staff chose to save the object rather than sacrifice it for text. They carefully lifted the largest burned lump from the ark, supported it so it would not collapse under its own weight, and sent it to the Israel Antiquities Authority for storage. There it was catalogued as a scroll from Ein Gedi and placed in a climate-controlled room, still locked in its charcoal shell. To understand why that decision mattered so much, it helps to zoom out for a moment to the wider Dead Sea region. About 20 miles to the north, in the desert cliffs near a place called Qumran, Bedouin shepherds had stumbled on clay jars filled with ancient manuscripts in the late 1940s. That discovery kicked off a decade of digging that revealed scrolls in 11 caves. These manuscripts, now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, included the oldest copies of many biblical books ever found,
which led the Israel Antiquities Authority to intensify their operations in the Judean desert.
written between about the 3rd century before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era. When scholars looked at those cave scrolls, they noticed something important. The biblical texts did not all look the same. Some copies matched the wording that later became standard in Jewish Bibles. Others lined up more closely with the Greek translation used by early Christians. Still others were similar to the version kept by the Samaritan community. In simple terms, the scrolls showed that in the Second Temple period, there were several live versions of the same books in use at the same time.
The parchment had been written in Greek, the language adopted after the conquest of Judea by Alexander the Great. The name of God, though, exclusively appears in Hebrew.
This idea is often called textual plurality, but all it really means is that the wording of Scripture was not yet completely fixed everywhere. That is why a burned Torah scroll in a later village synagogue near the same sea was such a big deal, even if no one could read it. After the excavation, the excitement slowly faded. The Ein Gedi scroll sat in storage in Jerusalem inside a box, inside a vault.
Quite a discovery. Fragments of a biblical scroll, along with other relics, have been found in desert caves in Israel.
Conservators checked on it now and then to make sure it was stable, but no one tried to read it. For more than 4 decades, what does it say? Was simple. No one knew, and no one had any safe way to find out. That quiet finally began to change in the early 21st century, when imaging specialists and computer scientists started asking a simple but bold question. Instead of cutting fragile scrolls open with blades and fingers, could they somehow look through them from the outside?
Archaeologist Dr. Sefi Parath found the scroll while digging in a synagogue.
How a charcoal lump turned back into a scroll. Hospitals use scanning machines to look inside the human body, and conservators wondered if the same idea could work on a burned scroll. To test it, they turned to a machine called a micro-CT scanner. A normal CT scan is the type of X-ray machine a doctor uses to see inside a chest or a head. It takes many thin X-ray pictures through the body from different angles. A computer then stacks those thin pictures together into a 3-dimensional model. A micro-CT scanner works the same way, but it is tuned for small solid objects instead of people. It can capture very tiny changes inside a piece of material. The team placed the Ein Gedi scroll inside this scanner. The machine sent a strong X-ray beam through the scroll as it slowly turned. Each time the scroll rotated a little, the scanner recorded another thin slice of what was inside. When the scan was finished, the computer held a 3-dimensional block of data that showed the whole interior of the scroll. The curators still had no idea whether any ink would show up. All they had at first was a cloud of gray tones that represented different densities of material inside the charred lump. When they examined the scan more closely and adjusted the contrast, something interesting appeared. Inside the gray shape of the parchment were brighter streaks that looked different from the rest. The parchment itself absorbed some of the X-rays. Empty air absorbed even less. But the ink, which contained heavier elements like metals, absorbed much more. That difference showed up as thicker, brighter lines in the scan. For the first time, the team could see that the scroll still held ink strokes inside. That meant there were still letters there. There really was a hidden text trapped in the burned roll. At this point, the job passed from conservators to computer scientists. The digital scan, which was a huge 3-dimensional file, was sent to William Brent Seals and his group at the University of Kentucky. He had spent many years working on ways to recover writing from damaged manuscripts using computers. His goal with the Ein Gedi scroll was simple to say, but very hard to do. He wanted to do inside the computer what no one could risk doing in real life. He wanted to find each layer of the scroll, treat those layers as pages, flatten them, and then show any ink strokes on those pages in the right order. The first problem his team had to solve was understanding the shape of the scroll inside the scan. To a person, the scan would look like a messy set of curved and folded surfaces, all pressed together and warped by fire. The computer had to find where one layer ended and the next layer began. The team wrote software that could trace the path of a thin sheet through the three-dimensional block, almost like drawing lines around each layer of an onion. In their papers, they call this step segmentation, but in simple terms, it means the computer learns to follow one sheet of parchment at a time as it twists and curves inside the lump. This was not easy. The heat from the synagogue fire had warped the scroll. In some places, layers were stuck together. In other places, there were bubbles, gaps, or folds. The software had to handle double layers, tiny cracks, and places where it was not clear if the material was parchment or something else. The team had to tune their method so that the virtual surface they traced stayed close to the real parchment and did not jump between layers. This careful tracing of the layers was the slow, patient part of the work, and it was the foundation for everything that came later. Once the software had a clear map of a single layer, the next step was to paint the right information onto that virtual surface. Remember that the scan contained information about density at every point. Some spots showed parchment, some showed air, and some showed ink. The team wrote code that took the darker, denser spots that corresponded to ink and wrapped that pattern onto the virtual parchment layer they had traced. This step is called texturing, but the idea is simple. The computer turns the raw scan into a fake but accurate image of what that layer of the scroll would look like if you could peel it out and stretch it in front of you. Of course, in real life, the parchment layer is curved. It wraps around itself many times. You cannot see all of it at once unless you flatten it. So the team added a final step. They took each traced and textured layer and mathematically pulled it flat, like pressing a crumpled sheet of paper until it lies smooth. Then they stitched those flattened pieces together at the edges. When this was done, the computer could show a single flat image that represented one full turn or wrap of the scroll. With the Ein Gedi scroll, the process worked so well that they could recover clear text from 5 complete wraps of the animal's skin. The final flattened view showed 2 side-by-side columns of writing. In total, there were 35 lines of Hebrew script. Each line held about 33 or 34 letters. The letters themselves were tiny, less than 1/10 of an inch tall, yet they still showed up as sharp, clear shapes on the computer screen. Some lines were complete, others were broken where the parchment had cracked, but enough survived that the words were readable. To make this possible, the team used artificial intelligence tools to detect patterns in the writing. The software learns to tell the difference between random noise in the scan and the specific shapes that belong to real ink strokes.
The software moves through the scroll, image by image, tracing the shape of a single scroll wrap. On the right, we see the 3D model that this produces.
That kind of smart pattern recognition made faint traces of writing stand out more clearly, especially in places where the ink signal was weak or blurred by damage. The most powerful moment came when all these steps came together. After years of the scroll being thought of as a dead object, the researchers finally had a flat image of one wrap of the scroll on their screens. Instead of a black, useless mass, they saw neat, horizontal lines of letters. Once they had that master image, the computer scientists sent the high-quality pictures back to the scholars in charge of the scroll collection. Those scholars could now do what they do best. They could study the image letter by letter and line by line and slowly work out what the text actually said. And it shocked them, because when experts compared those letters with the Bibles used in synagogues today, they realized the words on this once silent scroll were not what many of them expected to see. The message inside the scroll. When the black lump from Ein Gedi finally gave up its letters, the first clear words were not a strange hymn or a lost prayer or some wild new prophecy. They were instructions, very old, very strict instructions about how to bring animals and flour to the altar. The charred scroll from the burned ark turned out to be the opening of the book of Leviticus, the 3rd book of the Torah, written in ancient Hebrew. Leviticus is the book that most people skip.
5 complete wraps of the Ein Gedi scroll. The two distinct columns of Hebrew writing reveal the scroll to be the book of Leviticus.
It opens with rules for burnt offerings and grain offerings, with step-by-step lines about how a person brings a bull, a sheep, or a bird, how the priest handles the blood, and how flour and oil are laid on the altar. The En-Gedi scroll holds parts of those first rules. The readable lines cover the start of chapter 1 and part of chapter 2. There are no chapter numbers, no verse numbers, no punctuation marks, and no vowel signs. The words run as a long chain of consonant letters, the way Torah scrolls looked in late ancient times. Those missing vowel signs are a quiet clue to age. The small dots and dashes that show how to say the vowels in Hebrew were added in writing much later, around the early Middle Ages. Before that, readers learned the right sounds by memory and tradition. So a scroll that has only consonants and no vowel marks is almost certainly older than the 9th century AD, even before anyone checks it with scientific dating. When scientists did test it, they treated a tiny piece of the charred material and measured how much of a form of carbon was left in it. This is called radiocarbon dating. The test at the Weizmann Institute in Israel pointed to a date somewhere between the 3rd and the 4th century AD. Handwriting experts then looked at the shapes of the letters. They compared them to Hebrew scripts from different centuries. One leading expert, Ada Yardeni, argued that the letter forms looked even earlier, more like the second half of the 1st century AD or the start of the 2nd. Another scholar, Drew Longacre, pushed back and said that once you allow for gaps in the sample of later handwriting, the letter shapes can still fit the radiocarbon date in the 3rd or 4th century. So there is a range, not a single year, but everyone agrees on the big picture. This scroll was copied many centuries before the classic medieval Torah manuscripts that most printed Hebrew Bibles are based on, and only a few centuries after the last of the famous Dead Sea Scrolls were written.
Finding the Dead Sea Scrolls marked a significant leap forward in the history of the Bible. Further, the scrolls represented many examples of biblical scholarship at the time.
It sits in a gap where almost no complete Torah scrolls had survived at all. Before this burnt scroll spoke, many experts had a simple working picture of that gap. The Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran had already shown that in the last centuries before the Temple in Jerusalem fell, there were several slightly different forms of the Hebrew Bible in circulation. Some copies lined up closely with what later became the standard Jewish text. Others leaned more toward the Old Greek translation known as the Septuagint, or toward the Samaritan form used by the Samaritan community. Some even mixed features from more than one group. Because of that, many people expected that a Leviticus scroll from somewhere in the first few centuries AD would not match a modern Hebrew Bible word for word. They expected at least some small surprises in the wording. Maybe a few lines would be shorter, or one or two phrases would appear in a different place, or we would see a mix of traits from different text families. The discovery from En-Gedi dropped right into that expectation. What it actually showed was almost the complete opposite. Once the letters were clear on screen, the team handed the text to experts on the Hebrew Bible. Emmanuel Tov and his colleagues laid the new scroll's lines next to the standard medieval Hebrew text of Leviticus, the form known as the Masoretic text. Masoretic is just the name for the main traditional Hebrew Bible text used in most Jewish communities for many centuries. What they found stunned even people who already believed the text was very stable. Line after line matched perfectly. In fact, for the part that survived, the En-Gedi scroll is identical to the medieval Masoretic text in its letters and in its paragraph breaks. Not just close, not almost the same, but matching. A later report noted that this charred scroll even copies the same places where the text leaves a small gap to mark a new section, just like the much later Leningrad Codex, which is one of the key medieval Masoretic manuscripts. For this part of Leviticus, the words seem to have been locked in place much earlier than many experts had guessed. Once that burned scroll from En-Gedi finally spoke, it did more than surprise a few scholars. Its success raised a bigger question. If a lump of charcoal found in a synagogue ark could reveal this much, what else might still be hidden inside the blackened scrolls and fragments stored in vaults and storerooms around the world? The next scroll's coming back to life. The same mix of high-energy X-rays and AI is now being turned on another famous graveyard of books, the buried library at Herculaneum in Italy. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in AD 79, it covered a seaside town and a large villa in hot mud and ash.
the ancient Roman seaside town of Herculaneum, entombed along with Pompeii in 79 AD.
Inside that villa, later called the Villa of the Papyri, hundreds of book scrolls were baked until they turned hard and black. 18th century workers dug some of them out and tried to open them by hand. Many simply shattered into flakes and dust. Others were sliced apart, losing lines of text forever. For more than 200 years, most of that library looked like a pile of useless charcoal. Over the last few decades, that has started to change. Researchers scanned several of the Herculaneum scrolls with special X-ray machines that can see tiny density changes inside solid objects. They then used virtual unwrapping, the same basic idea that rescued the Ein Gedi scroll, to build flat images of hidden pages. At first, even those images showed almost nothing, because the ink on the papyrus did not always stand out in the scans. So the team at the University of Kentucky released the raw three-dimensional scan data to the public, and together with tech investors, launched something called the Vesuvius Challenge. It was a simple offer to coders and students around the world. If you can train AI to spot ink and letters inside these black tubes better than anyone else, there is prize money waiting for you. By early 2024, 3 young competitors had done exactly that. They taught their code to hunt for tiny texture changes in the scan that matched dried ink. The program then pieced those spots together as Greek letters and words. Their work pulled out more than 2,000 readable characters from one sealed scroll, enough to earn them a grand prize of $700,000 from the Vesuvius Challenge. The text they revealed was not a random list or a mythic story. It was a philosophical discussion of pleasure, most likely from the Epicurean writer Philodemus, talking about things like music, simple food, and whether rare treats are really better than ordinary ones. The same tools are already being pushed further. Another charred Herculaneum scroll in Oxford, known as FERC 172, has now been virtually unrolled as well. In that case, advanced X-ray scans and AI picked out Greek columns that include the word for disgust, written more than once, helping scholars link the text to a work on moral failings, again tied to Philodemus. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.